I have to admit that I was kind of lazy today, so I didn't really prepare a presentation about the school. That is because this is the last event that we're doing before the holiday. So this is the last Schools Out that we're doing. It's each Friday, last Friday of the month. The next one will be by Samia Henny, who is an architect and researcher from Algeria, who will be talking about Algeria also. And we are making the program for the second half of this year. So please keep in touch with us by Instagram or the website, of course. We have a number of workshops and things that will happen that I think are really worthwhile. Otherwise, we wouldn't organize them. Some of them are with Jort en Hollander, who is also here, who is an architect and a film director, who is also the initiator of the Architecture Film Festival Rotterdam about 20-some years ago. 25 years ago. And who is so kind to, for each Schools Out, choose a short film to accompany the evening. So after the lecture by Kenny and the Q&A, we will have a look at the short film that is chosen by Jort. Let me not go into the workshops. Please have a look at the website and maybe wait for 1 week when it's really final. Then I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Kenny Kuppers, Professor Kenny Kuppers, I should say, that we have known for, well, quite a bit, for 10, 15 years or so, and have worked with a little bit, not as much as I'd like to, though, also a long time ago, and who has an impressive CV that maybe you could summarize it as a studies of alternative histories of modernism throughout the time. The first thing that we worked on together was a book called Use Matters, which was an alternative view at the idea of use and users in architecture. Also looking at use not as simply a function of architecture, but as a historical construct that changes over time and that can have different meanings. And that was a bundle of articles that he edited. But and after that there were other investigations into modernism, and increasingly also into the relation between Africa and Europe, with books and publications that came out of it with titles that I'm really envious of, that all the time I think, well, yes, this is a book that we should have been writing, great, like The Earth That Modernism Shaped. That was this whole topic of designers actually designing in a global way. That was something that we all were also interested in. There were many figures, of course, in architecture history that did this kind of global exercises around the world. But yeah, I think these publications are really wonderful. And right now, I think the topic of tonight is going to be slightly different. It's not going to be about the global infrastructures and their meaning and their history, but it's also interesting because of the collaboration method that was behind this project that I cannot even start to pronounce. I will leave that to you. So not only for the topic, but also for the method, I think this is very valuable for us also as a school. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this very lovely introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here, also because I feel so much affinity with this program that you have set up. I remember when my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, many years ago, actually 20 years ago or something, mentioned Crimson. I thought, and I learned about Crimson, I thought, wow, architectural historians can do so many exciting things, and it was really a bit of a role model for me. So I'm excited to be here and to share some of my work that you so generously introduced. I should be about 40 minutes. If I go over time, then feel free to walk out, have a drink, or just tell me to speed it up. All right, and my talk today is going to be about how workers and peasants of Kamĩrĩĩthũ, that's how you pronounce that, I guess, a village in central Kenya, used architecture and the arts to fight neo-colonial injustice. In 1976, they came together to build a vast open-air amphitheater and to stage a play. Built on an open piece of land, the wooden structure could accommodate no less than 3,000 spectators, according to some witnesses. Its benches were laid out in a half circle of ascending rows that took advantage of the natural slope of the terrain, providing every seat with a central or a view of the central stage. This wooden structure dwarfed the homesteads of the village that surrounded it, but its seating capacity also exceeded that of official cultural institutions across Eastern Africa at the time, including the stately colonial-era National Theatre in the capital of Nairobi that you see here on the right. Comparably sized spaces of assembly in Africa at this time were not usually built for performances, but rather as representational spaces for newly independent governments. Despite its scale and significance, however, Kamĩrĩĩthũ's theater passed virtually unnoticed in the field of architecture. Even though interest in participatory architecture peaked during the 1970s, and that's also part of this first project that Michelle mentioned, and you see a typical example of that here, a 1970s public agora-type design for a museum in Brussels. So there was this peak of interest, but despite that, not a single article mentioned Kamĩrĩĩthũ. Not even Build Kenya, one of the country's few architecture magazines at the time, mentioned the project, despite its regular coverage of significant projects in the region, including this issue on village technology in 1977, the year the theater was built. In contrast to this neglect, Kamĩrĩĩthũ instead became a landmark of African literature and performance arts. The play, I Will Marry One I Want, was written by the writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o and the playwright Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and it centers on class struggle, on the role of religion, gender relations, and land grabbing. And these themes deeply resonated with many Kenyans and many Africans at the time, and many people in the global south. And the theater drew thousands of people from all over the country and far beyond. The press at the time depicted the theater as nothing short of revolutionary. It was so revolutionary, in fact, that soon after its opening, the Kenyan government, does somebody want to pick that? No. The phone? Okay. Oh, it's the doorbell. Okay. Somebody still want to? Yes, you got it. Okay. It was so revolutionary, in fact, that soon after its opening, the Kenyan government banned the play, imprisoned Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and later razed the wooden structure to the ground, without ever explaining why. Both authors went into exile, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o became one of the most important African writers of the century. In books such as Decolonizing the Mind, he recounted the story of Kamĩrĩĩthũ as a powerful experiment in decolonization. And this is receiving even more attention very recently because of his death just a month or so ago. After 45 years, or 45 years after it was banned, the play was finally performed again at Kenya's National Theatre in 2022. And now it was received as national heritage, finally returning home. Our research takes Kamĩrĩĩthũ theater as a starting point for understanding the role of architecture and urbanism in decolonization. Here you see the Kenyatta International Convention Center in Nairobi, finished about 10 years after Kenyan independence from British rule, so 1973. In the field of architectural history, buildings such as these figure prominently in narratives about African modernism. African histories of post-independence Africa have predominantly focused on architectural monuments and programs of nation building and development. And these raise important questions of form, of expertise, and of representation in architecture. The scholarly neglect of Kamĩrĩĩthũ's architecture, I argue, is due not only to its demolition or the lack of publicly available documentation because of its kind of violent demolition and banning, but also due to the dominant disciplinary frameworks which continue to uphold an analytical hierarchy between modernism and its others. And here I just want to say a few words about my own previous work and how I got to this research in the first place. In this book, The Social Project, Housing Post-War France, I explored the long shadow of social engineering undergirding 20th century housing and urban design. And key to this is the question of how we came to this peculiarly modern belief that by constructing a certain environment, we can intentionally shape society. And this is a belief that has a lot of power and also sometimes disastrous consequences that we can understand better, I argue, if we place works like Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation, which you see here on the left, within broader architectural, social, and architectural histories of housing. My more recent book here traces modernism back to an imperialist discourse about the influence of the environment on human culture. And what this shows is that buildings in purportedly regionalist styles, such as this German colonial prison in Namibia, have just as much to say about modernism as the Unité d'Habitation. So I argue in this book that that if we start from colonial conflicts over land and life in places such as Namibia and Poland that might seem far away from the main kind of arena of modernism, we can better understand how the design of buildings and landscapes came to intersect with the management of populations. And out of these interests about modernism, an empire developed an interest in African infrastructural life worlds. Together with art historian Prita Meyer and also more recently with an urban studies scholar, Wangoi Kimari, I've developed an interest in centering African imagination in the study of post-independent infrastructure. And this started from Ngugi wa Thiong'o's writings on the Trans-African Highway, published in this book here on the left. I briefly mentioned this trajectory just because it defines the direction I'm now taking as a researcher. First, I'm interested in better understanding the diverse and creative ways in which people responded to colonially imposed designs. And second, to build such an understanding, I think a very different method, a different way of working is needed, one that expands the purview of architectural history, as you were already mentioning before. Africanist and environmental humanities scholarship has done much to foreground the enduring ramifications of colonial systems of exploitation and production, epitomized by the plantation, the factory, and the shantytown pictured here. Kamĩrĩĩthũ theater, I argue, offers the possibility to trace how such an economic system is confronted from below. And the main argument I want to make today then is that it was not just the content of the play, I Will Marry When I Want, which is well known, but also the design, the construction, and the use of this open air theater that decolonized the mind, in Ngugi wa Thiong'o's own words. So to understand how, with the play and the theater, people reimagined and reclaimed their everyday environments in the wake of colonialism, studying the theater as architectural historians might have usually done, including myself, seems insufficient. It requires that we center architectural history on lived experience, on the social, the spatial, and the ecological relations and practices that exceed what we might find in an archive or what we might see in a photograph. So, in what follows, I first want to explain how I got to this as a method. Secondly, to analyze how the design and construction of the theater facilitated a kind of larger transformation of the village and the nation against the grain of colonialism. And finally, I want to examine the play itself as a kind of pedagogy, a spatial pedagogy of decolonization, in which knowledge about the region's colonial imprints was activated to turn life into an experiment. All right, so when my research partner, Dr. Makao Kitata, and I'll talk more about this in a second, also from the University of Nairobi's literature department, and myself, tried to contact the original performers of the play, many of whom are now in their 70s, we were met with this question. And that very much shaped the course of our work. Researchers come to take our story and then leave. How will you be any different? Giviga's question immediately situated us at the wrong end of a global political economy of knowledge production that echoes colonialism itself. A system in which knowledge is extracted from often poor, marginalized communities in the global south for the benefit of northern institutions and careers. So our answer to this question is one that we developed only gradually and in dialogue over the 5 years now that we've been working together. So calls for decolonization and epistemic redress in architectural history are often answered representationally, such as by decentering the West and by decentering narratives of modernism. But this question impels us to think about this mode of redress away from representation and instead as a kind of situated social practice that makes alternative historical narratives possible in the first place. So away from, let's say, the kind of narratives of decentering and more attuned to what that means very socially and practically in terms of how we might work together. So concretely, what this meant was that our research began with a community workshop that brought together the original performers to build trust and to figure out what we wanted to achieve together. And of this came the project to record everyone's story and make it public online. And the goal of this was to make that accessible to a Kenyan as well as a global audience, and for the performers to share this with friends and relatives. So a very immediate kind of utility. Between 2022 and 2024, we then produced over 2 dozen video interviews with original performers and other members of the community. And these interviews have now been translated with the help of the local interest organization Kwaweza Communications and published on YouTube as well as on our own website. So there's a kind of online digital archive of all of the life stories of the people that participated in this theater, which is was originally over 100, but now just a few dozen of them are still alive. But in order to better understand the architectural aspect of this theater, we also worked with a group called African Digital Heritage and some of the original performers, you see them meeting here, to figure out what the theater actually looked like, because it had been demolished and very few photographs were remaining. So based on these photographs and on the memory of the people acting in the theater, we reconstructed what that theater might have looked like architecturally. And this is what the African Digital Heritage group came up with then as a kind of 3D model. So then second, to better understand the legacy and the relevance of this play in Kenya, we worked together with a younger generation of activists from the social justice traveling theater, and they reenacted parts of the original play in another setting in Dandora, in a very urban setting in Nairobi, and also modified it to reflect their own experiences and how they have changed, and at the same time also, as they mentioned, have remained the same. And these workshops have fueled an interest in the heritage of Kamĩrĩĩthũ. So our longer term goal together with these groups is now to rebuild a performance space on the original site of the demolished theater. And we're also currently working on a film, and hopefully you'll have something to say about that as well in the Q&A, with a local filmmaker, Alexandra Majala, and other friends, to produce a feature-length kind of documentary that foregrounds the voices of the performers, and again looks at the kind of relevance of the play for Kenya today. And in this fragment, Salome Njeri talks about the emotional involvement of the performers and the audience. It's just a few minutes.
Nĩmaiguagĩra andũ acio tha mũno acio marũĩire wĩyathi nĩ tondũ nao aya rĩu maktaga ta andũ acio rĩ nĩmaktaga piũ mena ruo rũingĩ ngoro rĩu andũ arĩa akũrũ makĩrĩoya rĩ nĩmonaga biũ andũ arĩa marũĩire wĩyathi nĩma na ruo rũingĩ mũno no aya ng'uanza aya rĩu maragĩtwo Gen Z tondũ nĩo makĩrĩ Gen Z hĩndĩ ĩyo makenagio nĩ mĩkĩre ya maũndũ ũgakĩona nĩ marakena nĩ tondũ wa mĩkĩre no arĩa akũrũ nĩmonaga biũ andũ acio nĩ marĩ na thĩna mũingĩ mũno.
So this is where we're at for now, these various products, and it might seem kind of orderly to discuss that in hindsight, but it was very messy, and it was unclear actually what we were doing with those elements, so it was very much testing things out with the people that we were working with, and some of them were more successful than others. But so looking back, I would say this kind of collaborative method does not cannot bracket out questions of reflexivity, of positionality, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A. Second, also, I think it's important to acknowledge that this work was funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, so very much also in the interest of that organization. And while we did our best to spend as much as possible of that money for Kenyan and to capacitate Kenyan partners, structural inequalities, of course, very much remain unchanged. So these are clear limitations, but what I think this multimodal collaborative approach can do is to expand the possibilities of who makes history, who makes architectural history, and to recognize that history making is fundamentally also about making a different future. And I think there are many affinities again with the work that you all do here in that regard. So key to our project, Kamĩrĩĩthũ Afterlives, is working across these different domains of knowledge production: academic, artistic, community-based, and these are kind of silos that are not often actually considered together. And so what we wanted to do was to think transversally across these silos. So in this way, then, our work tries to nurture Kamĩrĩĩthũ Afterlives as much as it reveals them. And here I should, of course, acknowledge all the people that we've been working with over these past years, that are some university lecturers, such as Makau Kitata. They're filmmakers and NGO leaders, but also the original actors that are listed below, and then some institutions in Nairobi and in Kamĩrĩĩthũ itself that we engaged with and collaborated with. Okay, now I want to analyze a little bit what came out of that collaborative work. And that means also going a little bit back into history. So to understand the theater as architecture, I want to turn to the historical context from which it emerged. Kamĩrĩĩthũ lies in Kikuyu ancestral homeland, an area that became known as the so-called White Highlands. Following a vast program of colonial land grabbing by the British in the first half of the 20th century, agricultural communities were displaced to create vast tea and coffee plantations owned by white settlers. And these are the Lipton corporations that still exist today. And the colony of Kenya took shape around a colonial railway that was running from Mombasa to Uganda. And this was meant to open up Africa's interior for colonial exploitation. So the railway station of Limuru, which is very near Kamĩrĩĩthũ, became an important node of this new colonial economy. Much of the world-famous coffee and tea was shipped through Limuru station. And the station also became an ideal location for the establishment of one of the first modern factories, the Bata Shoe Company in 1938. Architectural historians have spent a lot of time, there are many books actually, about Bata's progressive approach to industry and Bata towns. In the first half of the 20th century, the company built factory towns in the Czech Republic, in Canada, Switzerland, and many other places. And these were regarded as marvels of modernist urbanism, of a kind of corporate welfare for the workers. Bata facilities in Kenya were similarly equipped with housing for employees, and a social club, and also a sports ground. But many of these amenities were not available actually to most of the workers, who were casual workers coming from nearby places like Kamĩrĩĩthũ. Kamĩrĩĩthũ itself, the village, was not in fact an ancestral location, an ancestral village, but a forced relocation camp. Anti-colonial movements had grown in the first half of the 20th century, culminating in a war for independence led by Kenya's Land and Freedom Army during the early 1950s. And in response, the British colonial government launched a gruesome counter-insurgency program. British forces rounded up people and contained them in tightly controlled camps, euphemistically called villages. Villagization was meant to separate the population from anti-colonial insurgents, and thus to permanently mold Africans into docile subjects. Scholars of British colonialism and post-colonial Kenya have done much to excavate this history, and the first accounts of these atrocities were written by Kenyans in the 1970s. They exposed a regime of incredible brutality that the British had tried to sweep under the carpet, so to speak, at the end of empire. And the archives were also kept secret and confidential. They've only been made public very recently. A colleague of mine, Ginger Nolan, has analyzed this program, this villagization program, from a design perspective. And it's this plan that she's published shows villages would be laid out as a kind of grid of individual plots with an open space in the middle. And this open space would be a kind of market square to provide economic opportunities or economic opportunities also for social exchange. Now, Nolan describes how these villages were meant to produce, quote, quasi-urban citizenship as an always incomplete form of political and economic enfranchisement, unquote. So basically, a kind of incomplete modernity or an incomplete modernization. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who grew up in this forced relocation camp, had already noted that villagization was not just an ad hoc emergency response to anti-colonial uprising, but also a feature of colonial planning with enduring consequences for post-independence Kenya. And in this citation from one of his books, this kind of conveys what he meant by that, or what that meant for Kamĩrĩĩthũ, the place where he grew up. Saying Kamĩrĩĩthũ became a permanent reservoir of cheap labor, and that was the intent of these villages. So of course the Bata shoe factory coming close and settling there or installing itself there was not a coincidence. Kamĩrĩĩthũ became home to displaced families from across central Kenya, people who had been made landless by British colonialism, without access to land or an extended family or network to sustain themselves. They were delivered to low-wage labor in the factory and the tea plantations. Here you see Kamĩrĩĩthũ's cadastral plan, and this shows the typical colonial village layout, adapted a little bit for the typology of the terrain, with plots of roughly equal size and an open space at the center. Kamĩrĩĩthũ's performer still refers to this space as the social hall of the village, echoing this colonial terminology of the space. And here you see social center on the map. Now this is what the so-called social hall or social center actually looked like. It was more of a village green than a market square. And in the back you see the barrack that was provided by the British. This is where adult education classes and community activities were being held in the years after independence. But despite the promises of independence and the kind of monuments to nation building that we see in Nairobi, being built in Nairobi at the time, Kamĩrĩĩthũ did not in fact change much during these years. To redress colonial land grabbing, Kenya's first president, Jomo Kenyatta, organized settlement schemes for landless peasants, but only a few people from Kamĩrĩĩthũ were able to benefit from these schemes. At the same time, Kenyatta was also responsible for entrenching a neo-colonial regime. He even, portrayed himself as the new king, in a way, of Kenya, and was also the biggest landowner of the whole country. And he helped a new class of elites, also grabbing public lands and other assets for private enrichment. So in Kamĩrĩĩthũ, considering the kind of pervasiveness of land grabbing in the post-independence period, word went around that the social hall, the only public land in the village, could also soon be grabbed. At the same time, Ngugi wa Thiong'o was teaching adult literacy classes already on the site, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o was teaching at the University of Nairobi, which is about an hour away by car. The village committee at the time informed both of them of the risk of land grabbing, and that is the reason why they started this play. So what this demonstrates is that Kamĩrĩĩthũ's open-air theatre was first and foremost a defense against land grabbing, against colonial land grabbing. Building a vast wooden structure would help safeguard the space for a shared future. So in their testimonies, the original performers describe how they worked together to build the theatre. Ngugi had organized the purchase of scrap material from a local wood store, and villagers worked together to build this structure. And during this time, food, childcare, and even healthcare was organized through mutual aid, which emerged as a result of the collective energy of building this open-air theatre. Formally, with its amphitheater, half-round amphitheater shape, you might say that the open-air theater did not look very original. You could even say that the main model for this open-air theater was the education building at the University of Nairobi, which you see on the right. Here, Ngugi wa Thiong'o and his colleagues would speak, and university plays were performed regularly. But to say that the form of Kamĩrĩĩthũ was kind of trickle-down colonial is to fall short of grasping its significance and the differences that make it so unique. The power of Kamĩrĩĩthũ's theatre lies not only in its form, but also in the participatory design and building process, and in the social and ecological relations that this sets up. This image here, which was published in the first Swahili edition of I Will Marry When I Want, shows how the shape and the layout of the theatre was conveyed to the builders with an arrangement of matchboxes and matches on the ground. And Jaramba, one of our interviewees and collaborators, has kind of reenacted this several times, explaining how this process of design was communicated and also done in a kind of participatory fashion. But despite this, participation, there was also a design educator involved. This was the Asian Kenyan researcher Sultan Somji. And Somji came to Kamĩrĩĩthũ upon Ngugi's invitation. He's also the one who took most of the still existing photographs, there are just a few, of Kamĩrĩĩthũ, including this image of one of the builders of the theatre, which you see on the left. Somji grew up in Eastleigh, an area that was designated for Asians in the segregated colonial city of Nairobi. He graduated from the University of Nairobi's design program in 1972, which was one of the first, together with Knust in Kumasi at the time, and he became then also a researcher at the university and at the National Museum. At the same time, Somji's awareness was shaped by Indians' participation in Kenyan anti-colonial struggles, and also the complex racial politics of being Indian in post-independence Kenya. His role in Kamĩrĩĩthũ theatre has been rarely explained, yet, as I'll explain in the next section, it allows us to situate Kamĩrĩĩthũ in the context of design, pedagogy, and popular education. Somji now lives in Vancouver, and on a Zoom call, he described to us how the builders used human steps to measure the distance between the theater rows, how they decided on the orientation of the sun, and how they prioritized acoustics by sending a listener afield until the distance of audibility was established. So a kind of embodied way of building the theater. And this was confirmed by our discussion of the 3D model with the original performers. So the performers, as much as Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his writings, emphasized the importance of the openness of the space. This imbued a sense of liberation and a kind of shared abundance for ordinary peasants and workers, and this very much in contrast to the faraway elite space of theatre in the capital of Nairobi. At the same time, the theatre's functional architecture also facilitated a kind of social transformation of the village. In revolutionary terms, you could say it was a social condenser. In fact, both Somji and Ngugi were heavily influenced by socialism at the time and had visited the Soviet Union. And there is another kind of Cold War element to this history that I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A. But here you see it as kind of empty, and how it was also a space that was used for other purposes, such as for grazing, when it was not being used as a performance space. And you see here there was a kind of how the theatre forged a collaboratively built space that brought a new consciousness in the community, and in doing so fundamentally transformed what were really intended as spaces of containment and control, which Kenya had inherited from colonialism, right? So the village itself was a kind of colonial design, and the theatre was very much a kind of motor, a social condenser to transform it and the society around it with this. When the theatre was banned, the government also imprisoned Ngugi wa Thiong'o for a year in a maximum security prison without giving him or anybody a reason why this was the case. And during this time, the theatre stood empty and was subsequently dismantled. And on its site, the government erected then about 7 years later a technical school. And this technical school, of course, did provide the community with some educational opportunities, mostly for kind of vocational training, but it also silenced the community and permanently halted the kind of pedagogy that was Kamĩrĩĩthũ theatre. So in this last part, a little shorter, I hope, I'll just turn now to the kind of pedagogical aspects of this space, and I want to give you a sense of how the theatre, the play, together with the space, elaborated a kind of pedagogy for decolonization. And to do that, I have to say a few things about the plot of the play. The play centers on two families. The poor family of Kigunda, Wangeshi, and their daughter Gathoni is shown here on the left. They have only a small piece of land to live off of. And you see the title deed of that piece of land hanging proudly on the wall of their humble home. Then on the right, you see the kind of setting of the rich Christian family of the corrupt businessman Kioi, who is making a lucrative deal with a foreign multinational to build a factory, rings a bell, with the Bata, for which they need Kigunda's little piece of land. And that's what the play is about. So you see the rich family on the right having dinner in their house, furnished with a television at the center, and this was very much a symbol of elite privilege in the 1970s for Kenya. So the rich Kioi tries to trick the poor Kigunda into giving up his land. At the same time, the daughter, Gathoni, is being pursued by Kioi's son. Both the business affair and the love affair end in disaster. And the play then is a parable of neocolonialism in Kenya. And the daughter, Gathoni, becomes a symbol of the nation, of Kenya's own exploitation. The daughter Gathoni, with her insistence to marry when she wants, the title of the play, stands for the country at large. Kenya's insistence to independence and resistance against foreign exploitation. So in this sense, the play evokes local injustices as much as it evokes a kind of global inequality of power. So as the audience watched the play in the open landscape, the backdrop of homesteads, tea plantations, and the nearby factory reminded them of how this inequality was embedded in the land around them. Gishamba is a factory worker and also a kind of protagonist of the play. He plays the role of the revolutionary agitator who makes the relationship between local exploitation and global power explicit. Here is a snippet of the reenactment of the play with the social justice traveling theater. Let's see if it works.
During that period, you have made shoes worth million. You are given a mere 200 shillings. The rest, sent to Europe. Another fortnight is over. You are on the night shift. You leave your wife sweat. You go back at the machine. You sweat and sweat and sweat. In the morning, you go back home. You're drunk with sleep.
So Samuel Ocheng here is acting as Gishamba, who's decrying the exploitative working conditions in the local factory. And you see how they've reenacted also or remade some of the original props, even the title deed you see also hanging on the wall here of the house. So Gishamba's character gave performers and spectators a role model for defiance, a defiance against an oppressive system that was not much different from colonial rule. Jaramba, who played Gishamba in the original play, here in his testimony speaks about how playing this role changed him.
Mtu kama mimi niliachieve something sababu nilijijua na niliona wezi pita laini ya kunitesa. I have to ask you a question. Nitakuuliza swali. Kwa nini unanitesa?
So while the Bata Shoe Company is not explicitly named in the play, it was clear to anybody in Kenya and in the audience that Gishamba's exploitative job was there. James Githiga Mwara played Kigunda's character, and his father worked in the Bata Shoe factory, his mother in a nearby tea plantation. He started working at the factory himself in 1968 and was still working there when he joined Kamĩrĩĩthũ Theatre in 1977. He experienced the toxic effects of the chemicals, especially in the tanning part of the company, of the factory himself, and this is also what the play is about.
Ciganona toni ndutite nginya thito kuria chemical icio ciaigagwo Africans aria mari kuu makandikwo andu mekuhatiriria andu ao na wathi kuga ti take him down kuambiwa hivyo ni uthi kwa personnel ukore uri uku discipline ni twahatiriirio muno oho mami angeumire kuria ikaraga oke guku no ari kaya akauga athi gwiteithia gicoka tari karuhuo kaguo karoka aroka akiuga muikaraga atia guku mutigua munungo uyu na ni munungo ucio ni utumite andu aingi o mathie thibitari makerwo magucitie kindu gitari kiega.
So the play suggested that to regain their humanity, workers needed to stand up. And that is in fact, as they had done and continued to do so before. Newspaper research from this period reveals how Bata shoe factory workers organized multiple strikes in the 1960s and 70s. It would take until the 1990s for the company to clean up its industrial pollution, as reported on the right. But the play played a role in sensibilizing people about it. So even though it was just a play, you could say it really had momentous environmental consequences for the area that it was in. The play evoked a sense that things can be different, that they don't have to be the way they are. performers and spectators could see the village, the factory, and the plantations as part of an interconnected system that shaped their lives. That inequality was about relationships in the end, right? And making this system legible is what opened up possibilities for change. In this passage, Gishamba, the revolutionary, laments how the plantations with their tarmacked roads and lavish homes of the rich contrast with the homes of the poor and their lack of access to basic health services or even asphalted roads. There was such a thing as T-roads, which the Kenyan government was sponsoring and building lavishly, you could say, whereas many other areas of the country went without roads or still go without roads today. And this echoes Frantz Fanon's spatial reading of the colonial city. Here, Gishamba offers such a reading of power and equality rooted in the specificity of Kenya's own history. It's important to note that the play was not just inspired by the landscapes around it. It was constituted by and advanced a collective practice of reading social and power relations from the land. Wangari Hinga and her family were also forcibly displaced from their land during the colonial period, and they came to Kamĩrĩĩthũ in 1960. What inspired her to join the theater was the experience of being, as she says, a slave to the white man. In this fragment, she explains the logic of colonial land grabbing.
Mũthũngũ rĩrĩa okire rĩ agĩkĩnyitĩra rĩu nĩguo kwaheanagwo akĩnyitĩra kũrĩa kwega andũ makĩhatĩrĩrio na gũkũ merekio na gũkũ werũ tondũ gũtarĩ ona maĩ gũtirĩ ona maĩ athũkũ cio nĩmenjagĩra maĩ mametagwo ndobori tondũ nĩcio ciyũrĩte na gũkũ guothe bũrũri wa na gũkũ mĩena ĩno ya riũa rĩu kũrĩa kwarĩ kwega ũngĩcaria rĩu ona rĩu wĩ hau ũguo ona tigana ũkĩnjũria ciũrana no wega rĩ.
So to me, this very much illustrates this kind of legible or making legible of relationships and in the landscape. Lucy Wangoi here mentions how you could say Kenya's struggle was also Kenya's second liberation struggle, and this was also a matter of women liberation, and she emphasizes that in her testimony here. Born in 1948, she and her family became landless as a result of British colonialism, like so many others. She joined the theater and played the role of Njoki, who together with her husband, Gishamba, fights for justice. And here, in this particular fragment, she speaks about what independence meant for women at the time.
Tutiagire gukorwo atumia amwe matengetwo na angĩ magĩka atĩ twagire nĩ gũkorwo atumia tũnyitanĩte tũkorwo twĩ hamwe na tũngĩnyitana no tũteithanie.
So women liberation was also a matter of overturning an older patriarchal system, not a colonial, but an older patriarchal system of land ownership, as she explains here. I hope.
Matangĩkĩona mbia cia kũgũra mũgũnda. Ningĩ mĩgũnda hĩndĩ ĩyo no ũrĩa warĩ ho wakoragwo wa mũthuri. Ona mĩgũnda hĩndĩ ĩyo na mũthuri angĩakuire ti atĩ nĩanjũĩ kana nĩandĩkagwo nĩ mũtumia ndiũĩ hau ndiamenyaga. Tondũ akĩandĩkagwo na kuna arĩa ithaka cia mbũri. Ndiarĩ rĩu ũguo yacokire ĩgĩtuĩka ĩgĩkwo demarcation ĩkĩingĩrio gwĩ thirikari.
So the play allowed performers and spectators to understand the injustices that defined everyday life in Kamĩrĩĩthũ and in Kenya by extension. And with this liberatory pedagogy, they did not stand alone. Playwright Ngugi wa Thiong'o had in fact drawn inspiration via Augusto Boal from Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, which maybe some of you might have heard about, a revolutionary pedagogy that was rooted in Brazil's experience of the colonial plantation system. And Augusto Boal's theatrical technique aimed similarly to empower marginalized communities by making them active participants in their performance, encouraging them to reflect on and transform their everyday realities. Ngugi wa Thiong'o would in fact continue this pedagogy in Zimbabwe after fleeing Kenya, where he would receive ample support from the Mugabe government and established dozens of these community theaters in the country since. And this is kind of afterlife of Kamĩrĩĩthũ still to be written. But it just shows that Kamĩrĩĩthũ theater, even though it was such a specific historical episode, you could say, it also part of a larger global Southern movement aimed to address the exploitation and the toxicity of the plantation, the factory, and ultimately also the slum. Sultan Somji, whose role in the participatory design process I just discussed, also went on to theorize Kamĩrĩĩthũ's pedagogy. He calls this Kamĩrĩĩthũ method in some of his books also, and this method for him was about centering the knowledge of workers and peasants in design, in material culture, and in popular education, which he was teaching and researching then at the University of Nairobi. And I think it's interesting also how his career and his trajectory shows how these things that we usually tend to separate, material culture, design, architecture, popular education, were very much part of a kind of continuum of interests for him. So his approach was a far cry from primitivist renderings of indigenous culture, even though you might look like it from the title of this, the cover of this book. It was also very much far removed from the kind of developmentalist approaches that were being taught at the University of Nairobi during the 1970s, and you could say very much still today. And he would, really build this Kamĩrĩĩthũ method through participatory peace museums in the 80s and 90s. And again, this is still a history that is being written, actually, at the moment by another scholar. So the work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Somji highlights that Kamĩrĩĩthũ was not only an insurgent art, but also a pedagogical experiment. And just to conclude, I want to say Kamĩrĩĩthũ's open-air theater may seem far removed from the institutions and discourse of architecture, of modernism. There was no professional architect, there was no claim to authorship, there was no publication in architectural journals, etc. At the same time, Kamĩrĩĩthũ offers us the prospect of an architectural history from the South, one that is grounded in the lived realities and aspirations of the majority world. And many architectural historians have argued that Africa compels us to rethink modernism, and recent African architectural histories have tried to do so, but I would say have still held this kind of hierarchical distinction between modernism and its others. And I think Kamĩrĩĩthũ theater defies that disciplinary framework, because its architecture, you could say, is not modernism, because it lacks both original form and authorial intention, right? It's not according to the rules of what we want to understand as modernist, but at the same time it's very functional, and it's also a social condenser, and that perhaps was one of the key arguments or one of the key logics of modernism, that architecture could serve to transform society. You could also say, that Kamĩrĩĩthũ's architecture is not vernacular, because it doesn't represent any ethnicity or any cultural tradition. You could even say it's European in form, if you want, but that form ultimately doesn't really matter so much as, again, the use and the social relations that this form sets up. So, in recovering this history, I want to say that we don't just restore a moment of blossoming that was violently erased by the post-colonial state, but also that we can do so, or that this story allows us, at least for this audience, to think of new horizons for architecture as a collective transformative practice, one that refuses to separate design from justice. Thank you for your patience.